All right, welcome to another Foundation Friday. Today we have James Mallory from Elevation Heating and Cooling, and he's going to talk to us about adding heat pumps and AC and how to do it most effectively and save money. James, take it away, bud.
Okay. Feel free to jump in with questions at any time. I'm actually going to give me 1 second here. I'm going to switch my screen because it's a little bit hard to see the notes. So give me 2 seconds here. And
Hmm.
then I'm going to share it the other way. Okay. Did that work okay? Still see it?
Very good.
Okay. So let's jump in and talk heat pumps. So I get a lot of questions on heat pumps running from real basic to complicated. So I'm just going to buzz through the basics of them real quick. A heat pump is essentially just an air conditioning unit that can run in reverse. If you looked at it from the outside, you would not be able to tell if it's a heat pump or AC. Has 95% the same parts. It can just reverse the flow of refrigerant, and instead of cooling your house, it'll take that heat, that latent heat left in the air, and warm your house. So the big question is that I find is, okay, why would you want a heat pump and a heat pump versus AC? There are a lot of considerations here. A lot of it comes down to cost. So there's an interesting map that shows the economics of this. It might be a little bit hard to see, but this is the percentage of houses that if you currently have AC, you would see a positive cash flow. You would save money by adding a heat pump. So if you go way up to Washington, it's a little bit hard to see, but you get up to 48% of homes would save money. Here's where it gets tricky though, when thinking about adding a heat pump. This is if a customer does not have any AC and they just want to add a heat pump. You see a lot of zeros in the upper left part of that screen, right? Washington has a whole 1%. So what this means is that if a customer calls me and says, I want to add a heat pump, well, first we'll talk about why. Is it for environmental, ecological reasons? You want to lower greenhouse gases, things like that. Okay, that makes sense. If it's strictly a financial decision, it does not make sense to add a heat pump because the cost of adding that heat pump itself, you will not pay it off in the lifetime of that heat pump. Because most homes in our area are natural gas is pretty cheap. Heat pumps can be fairly costly, and the payoff horizon where those two lines cross is too far out in the future to make sense. So the better way to think of it is if you intend on getting air conditioning, you want to cool your house, and you're going to do that no matter what, then adding the additional cost of a heat pump starts to make a lot more sense. The economics start to pay off for it because the additional price of going from an AC unit to a heat pump is maybe 10%, maybe 15%, not a large amount. And that cost will be absorbed by the more efficient heating of your house throughout the rest of the year. The reason why it doesn't make sense if you weren't planning on adding air conditioning is because pretty much everybody who has a heat pump is going to be tempted to use it in the summer as an air conditioner. It would be hard to resist that on a hot day. So now this house that never burned any energy in the summer for heating or cooling now is going to have an air conditioner running 3, 4, 5 months of the year. So your overall net energy for that house for the year is going to go up. Yes, you're saving a lot in the winter, but now you're running an air conditioner 3, 4 months of the year. So it negates all that benefit. Now, I find for most people, their driving decision is, hey, I just want to cool my house off. So it does make sense because now we're just talking about that incidental additional cost to get that heat pump. But it's something to keep in mind, depending if you're where the ultimate kind of desire is behind what you're shooting for. Okay, now if you are, or actually one more thought on heat pumps I find, back to our little photo here. A lot of people that have moved from the East Coast have a pretty negative view of heat pumps, I find, because they were kind of on the leading edge out there and have a very cold climate. And heat pumps traditionally don't work well in cold climates. They really struggle below, say, 30, 35 degrees. So I find a lot of clients that have moved from Vermont, New Hampshire, Boston area, they don't want a heat pump. And I get it because the original ones were not very good. and they would break a lot, and you had to have a backup heating system. Things have changed quite a bit. They still are not as efficient in very cold temps, but the newer models can go down to 5-10 degrees if you get the right line. So in our climate, that's all we would ever encounter. And maybe on Montana and Idaho, it still wouldn't be sufficient, so they need a stronger backup. But a lot of those frustrations that people had with heat pumps in cold climates, those have been dealt with. They're much more effective at those cold climates. Okay, picking a model. Now, if your clients are out there getting a quote on adding air conditioning or heat pump, they're going to be confronted with a quote that likely has 2 or 3 options, right? Silver, gold, platinum, good, better, best. Most companies are going to have a range of 2 or 3 options to pick from. There's really only 2 things I care about, or I want your clients to care about. I want them to care about the type of compressor and whether it's going to get a rebate or a credit. The companies aren't always going to be super clear about these. They'll just say, silver, gold, platinum, not really indicating what's the difference. So this is the thing I want you to think about is those 2 items. Let's first at the compressor. So this little graph shows the top one, the zigzag line. That's a standard old-fashioned single-stage air conditioner. It's on, it's off, it's just a binary, all or nothing type system. Say anything 10 years and older, 15 years and older, that's what 95% of them were. The other options didn't really exist. They're effective. They definitely will cool a house. The problem is, let's say it's 80 out. It's not 95, it's not 65. It's warm enough to need air conditioning, but not enough to go to full capacity. Well, a traditional single-stage air conditioner is just going to turn on for 5 minutes, and then it'll have fully cooled it, and then it'll turn off. 5 minutes later, it needs to turn back on, and it's kind of flipping on and off. Not terribly efficient in a mild climate like ours. Washington's kind of strange, right? Because we can have really hot days. A few years ago when it hit 110, but then most of our time is in a very mild 80s, mid 80s, things like that, where we don't need a high capacity system. So if you size it for those really hot days, it is going to be way too powerful for the rest of the time, and you'll get this kind of on-off setting in your system. It'll make it run much shorter, and it's not terribly comfortable to have this blast of frigid cold air and then back to nothing. Now, if a customer just says, well, I don't really care, I'm only going to use this thing 1 month of the year when it's really hot, and they're not going to use it that often, then that's fine. I would just do a single stage system. If they plan on using it, May through September, and they really don't ever want to have their house above 70 degrees, then they want it sustained, even conditions, then the variable speed compressors or 2-stage are really helpful for maintaining that even flow. And that's what those little graphs represent, more of a gradual line or even a nearly flat line to the variable speed. Okay, but here's where it gets strange. In today's world, there are a lot of credits out there for heat pumps. And again, the customer is calling for a AC or asking you when they're thinking of buying a house, oh, I perhaps want to add air conditioning, and they're not mentioning heat pumps. The question of heat pumps is going to come up because you don't get credits for installing air conditioners. Clearly, they want to reduce energy consumption. So the credits only apply to heat pumps, but the credits are so big these days that often the higher end unit, or we'll say mid-range units, are less expensive than the cheapest ones. Here's a good example. So the one on the left, the ML17, is a very basic, bare bones, single stage heat pump / AC, 16,000. This is for everything, a whole new furnace installation. And the much higher end unit, the one on the right, is actually a couple $100 less because you get that $2,000 federal credit. The credits only apply to that upper mid-range and above level of heat pumps, and often that's more or this than the cost of the price difference. So it's in an unusual spot where your mid-range is often cheaper than your low range because of the credits that come through. We'll get a little bit more into the specific credits that depend on where you live, what kind of system you've got set up. Okay. Customers are often asking whether they should go to a full heat pump system, no gas, or keep it with keep the gas as kind of a backup hybrid combo. It was a really common question for homes in Seattle. We're going to run you through a few factors that will influence that decision. So the first is the sound. It is hard to get a heat pump approved or an air conditioner in downtown Seattle on a narrow lot. We're running into this on a project right now. You've got a 33-foot wide lot, and it requires a 20-foot setback from the lot line. There's nowhere to put that unit. It's just simply not possible. There are walls that you can construct and things like this to help deal with it, but the pure heat pump units without any gas are much quieter. So those are much more likely to pass. So if I've got a customer that really wants a heat pump, air AC, they've got a narrow lot, and they don't, then that would push you toward a pure heat pump system versus keeping your gas. Now, in general, if somebody's got a natural gas furnace and it's aging, it's time to replace it, and they want to add air conditioning, in most cases, I would rather leave that furnace, or I mean, we'll replace the furnace, but leave the gas component and have a hybrid. Heat pumps are complicated. They definitely break. There are a lot of fuses and small parts, capacitors, things that can go out. And if that happens to go out during a really cold stretch, it's great to have that gas fireplace as a backup. It will easily heat the entire house in the event of a failure of that heat pump, or let's say you've got power outages. Where I live, we lose power all the time. You do not want to run a heat pump on a generator. You will fry that heat pump. But you can certainly run a gas furnace off of a generator, and it takes very little electricity to run those. The other factor is the size of the house. If you've got a 3,000 square foot house, it's going to be very difficult to heat that off of a heat pump alone. Now, I'd say your typical house in downtown Seattle, for example, 1,800 square feet, 2,000, 2,200, most of those can be heated entirely by a heat pump alone. But as you get into those bigger sizes, it becomes trickier, or you need to go to a dual system. Okay, last thought on gas. Heat pumps provide very steady but moderate heat in a house. They do not have the capacity of gas. So if you're the customers are the type that you like to crank the heat way down at night, have a nice cold house, and then in the morning you throw the thermostat up and crank it up to 70, that's not going to work with a heat pump. It might take 2 hours to heat the house. So if a gas can do that in probably 20 minutes, there's just so many more BTUs ready to heat that house. So a little bit of coaching that people often have to go through when they convert to a full heat pump is just recognizing they're not designed to go through these big variations. You kind of want to set it and forget it. If you like a cold bedroom, like me, then the answer is keep the heat pump set at its daytime setting throughout the night, but close the register of the room, something like that, where you would allow the room that you want to cool off, but keep that heat pump cranking all night long. Now, that only matters if it's going to be really cold at night. If it's only getting down to 45, you could turn it down, no problem. If it's getting down to the 20s at night, that's where you start needing to really keep that heat pump running all night long to be able to stay on top of it. See, Seattle is interesting. They will not allow you to put a heat pump in that is big enough for the coldest days. It's right there in the code. They only allow you to size a heat pump for 98% of the days. Well, 2% of the year, they just say, well, put on a sweater, get a space heater. They don't really have a plan for that. So it's not going to keep up. Again, that gas furnace backup can come into play there and easily heat the house. Or sometimes a customer has just a gas fireplace, and we'll have a conversation. Look, if you want to go pure heat pump and you got this gas fireplace insert, that'll handle the coldest days, give you a little bit of extra boost, and you should be good. And those can also be a nice backup in the event a heat pump struggles. Okay, let's talk furnaces. So let's say you've got a gas furnace and you want to add air conditioning. This is one of the biggest scams I see out there, is adding a high efficiency furnace when somebody's adding a heat pump AC unit. You do not need a high efficiency furnace if you're adding a heat pump, because the furnace is basically going to run like 2 or 3 days of the year, almost never. There's no point in putting money into a really high-end fancy furnace that's just sitting there as a backup on only the rarest of days. Take that money and put it into a better air conditioning heat pump unit and just keep a basic 80%er in there. Ironically, these new high-efficiency furnaces, well, they're not new, they've been around for 20 years, but newer high-efficiency furnaces are far more fragile. The life expectancy is way less than the old furnaces. Kind of like everything in life, you know, refrigerators, clothes washers, things are getting much more complicated. The same is true of furnaces. So I actually prefer to have my favorite combo for people is old-fashioned 80% furnace, real straightforward, not a lot to break, combined with a heat pump AC. Put the money there, keep your low-efficiency furnace. It will last much, much longer over the life of that system. Okay, let's talk prices. Everybody always asks, you know, they're looking at buying a house and they want to know, okay, just give me a ballpark what it's going to cost to add AC to a house. So just threw some prices down in here. Don't hold me to any of this. This is just a general range. I think what strikes most people is that adding AC when keeping a furnace is pretty expensive compared to just replacing the whole thing. And that is certainly true. If you've got a furnace that's only 3 or 4 years old and you want to add air conditioning to it, it's possible in most scenarios, but you're basically starting from scratch because that whole furnace typically has to get pulled off, the coil is put back on, and now the furnace is reinstalled, and the actual outdoor compressor, everything has to be done the same as a whole new system. So you're really only saving the actual product cost of the furnace, which isn't that much. They're fairly inexpensive. The big cost is the compressor, the AC unit, the coil, things like that. So this is why it's best to do it during a regular replacement. I much prefer to go to a house if they've got a 15-year-old furnace and it's already kind of naturally time to swap it out. Makes sense. If it's somebody just bought a new furnace, like I saw this last week, the home seller, noticed that the furnace was at the end of its life. So as part of the prep for listing rather, they put in a new furnace, but they didn't put a coil on it. So the buyer now is faced with tearing out this whole furnace and starting over, and even though it's only 1 year. So if you are going to replace your furnace and you're not interested in air conditioning, in most cases, I would recommend just pay to put the coil on there. It's not going to be more than $600-700, and just now you're ready for the next homeowner or yourself in years to add air conditioning to it. You've done the hard part for fairly low cost, and it's prepped and ready to go. That's so much more efficient than if we show up a few years later and have to kind of start from scratch. Okay, heat pump versus AC, you can see in there, and this is actually probably a little, yeah, that's pretty right. Typically about $1,000 to $1,500 premium. So if you're going to get AC, in most cases, people will say, okay, it makes more sense in the long run just to get the heat pump version of it because you'll get those credits and it'll drive that price down by a couple $1,000. Where it starts to get expensive, say $20,000 and above, is when you've got blended systems, ducted mini splits, combined with an air handler, multiple heads throughout rooms, in addition to an air handler. Those start to get into the low 20s at that point, maybe mid 20s for a pretty extensive system. Okay, back to the point that I said a few minutes ago. In the strange world of furnaces, high efficiency furnaces don't last nearly as long. And this is probably even an optimistic to say 14 to 17 years. I see a lot of them fail sooner than that. So again, low efficiency furnaces are my favorite. If you've got an 8 to 12-year-old furnace and you want to add AC, Again, that furnace cost is pretty minor in the grand scheme of it. It makes more sense just to replace it and start over. A well-maintained AC should be able to last 15 to 18, but there's a big caveat there. Most are not well-maintained. I don't really care if you go several years without cleaning your furnace or maintaining it. Furnaces are pretty tough. They can handle a lot of abuse and poor maintenance. As long as you're on your filter change cycle, you'll be fine. Air conditioners and heat pumps that is not the case. If those get clogged on the outside, you can easily cause very, very expensive repairs. So don't spend money on duct cleaning. Don't spend it on over the top cleaning of that furnace, but I would spend it on annual maintenance for an AC heat pump. You'll get a lot longer life out of those things with that kind of maintenance. Okay, rebates. There's some good news here amidst this. There are a lot of rebates out there right now. Let's rattle through them real quick. So the IRS has a $2,000 heat pump credit. The thing that's nice about this is it doesn't require you to drop your furnace. You can keep a furnace, add a heat pump, and you get the $2,000 credit. Now, it's a tax credit, so you still pay the full amount up front, and then when you file your taxes, you'd claim that $2,000 credit. So you'd have to talk to, your CPA about that filing. But it's a very broad category of heat pumps that are included in that. So in most cases, we can find a qualifying heat pump AC unit. Okay, PSC is a little trickier. You've got to be both a gas and electric customer, which does not include downtown Seattle. It does include houses on the east side and on the northeast side. They've got a $3,000 credit going right now. So if you get both those together, $5,000 is pretty lucrative if you happen to live in an area with PSC. Seattle itself is much less. It's like a $300 or $400 credit. Not nearly as exciting. However, if you've got an oil furnace in Seattle, there is a $2,000 credit rebate for swapping that out. And that comes out off the top right on the front end. You don't have to file for that. So if you've got a Seattle oil furnace, that could be combined with the IRS one as well. Okay. Where are you going to put this thing? I'm sure you've encountered heat pumps in Seattle where it is installed in the front yard and you think, okay, why is somebody putting a heat pump compressor in the front yard? Well, this is why. The sound ordinance for Seattle is very, very strict. Sorry, I'm just going to look at the meeting chat here. Somebody asked a question. Is gas referring to natural gas or does it include propane? Yes, I would include propane in that as well. It's just a minor tweak to the system to have propane in there. So they would be lumped together for all those previous points. Okay, sound violations. So if this house on the left was in Seattle, there's no way you're going to put your AC compressor in the side yard. Unfortunately, most people want it on the side because you don't want it in the backyard where you want a quiet place for your porch and seating. You don't want to hear a fan blowing. Front yard has aesthetic issues. So most people's first desire is the side yard. Typically, you're going to need at least, say, 7 to 8 feet, and in many cases, 10 feet between the compressor and the lot line. A lot depends on if it's between the two houses or further in the backyard. But I would say as a good rule of thumb, plan on a minimum of 8 feet, not to the neighbor's house, but just to the lot line. And the unit itself is typically 2 feet wide. So again, you're probably going to need at least 11 feet of space between the house and the lot line for it to pass in Seattle. Now, if you happen to be outside of Seattle, it's much easier. This right here would probably pass. You just need enough clearance for the manufacturer. And most of the other cities and county regulations are much more lenient on this. This is a project we were quoting on recently where the customer wanted in the front, and actually this was the best option for it. A little pad in the front, a little bit unconventional. I think it's might not be everybody's favorite from an aesthetic standpoint, but until those code regulations change, that is where you're going to see more and more coming. I just was talking to the Seattle sound ordinance official yesterday, and they're frustrated as well. The city is really trying to electrify the system, get everybody on heat pumps, but these sound violations are quite strict, and with the narrow lot lines, it becomes trickier. So something you want to have a conversation with. The contractor is supposed to do a calculation to make sure it works. If it's not done right, or they just don't do it, it's quite possible that your neighbor in 6 months, long after the contractor is paid, will call the city, file a complaint. They'll come out and test it and say, you need to move your compressor. That is a big, big deal. That is many thousands of dollars, probably $4,000 or $5,000 to move that compressor. So we want to get that on the front end. Make sure if you're in the city that your contractor is doing the calculations, thinking this through, because you want to get on that in the front end before it's installed. Okay, I'm just going to rattle off a few questions that I hear quite often when people are thinking about adding air conditioner, and some of these have kind of counterintuitive explanations. So, why is my upstairs so much warmer? I just added AC. Why is the upstairs hot? Most people would intuitively understand the first aspect, which is just warm air rises. So certainly the upstairs is going to be warmer. Yep, get that. But there's a second reason that often really exacerbates this. Your house, let's say your furnace or air handler is in the garage or basement, like most cases in our area. The trunk line servicing the upstairs is usually crunched down into a wall cavity. And even if the HVAC company did it right, usually the framing contractor, electricians are bending that ducting, compressing it, crushing it. So by the time the house is done, it is a much smaller trunk line than was ever intended. And you just are not getting very much air to that upstairs. So you combine that with just the natural movement of warm air upward, and you can have a pretty big difference. I tell customers, if you're just putting in a standard air conditioner with a 2-story house, I would assume at least a 5 to 7 degree temperature difference between the upstairs and the downstairs. Now, where this causes a problem is if your master bedroom is upstairs, or let's say you've got a home office upstairs and you want to keep that at 68, and what is that going to do to the downstairs? If it's upstairs at 68, the downstairs could easily be 62 degrees. Very, very cold. Not just uncomfortable, you could lead to condensation issues and other problems. So it's something to coach a customer on. If they really like a cool office or a cool master bedroom, and those are upstairs, it might not be possible to achieve that with a traditional system. So let's look at some of those options real quick. You got 2 real choices here. A zone system, which is basically you've got all your normal ducts running throughout a house, and the system has a brain on it that will tell it to send more air to a zone, typically upstairs versus downstairs. They're really popular, say 10, 15 years ago. There are probably some of your customers that have bad experiences with them. They were quite complicated and prone to air. They often would lead to a frozen coil. You pull off the coil cover and it's just a block of ice inside the garage because the zone system wasn't working properly. They can work well. They're pretty difficult to add to an existing house. Usually they're done well when it's a brand new house and you've got access to all the ducting. A little bit tricky to add them after the fact. So in most cases, I would rather see most customers are going to benefit from a divided system. So let's say you've got ducting throughout the whole house, 2-story house, pretty standard setup. Upstairs, they don't have air conditioning yet, but we're predicting it's going to be much more difficult to cool that upstairs. A couple ways to do it. My favorite is to do a ducted mini split on the upper floor. So ducted mini split is, I don't know why they use the name mini split because there's really no resemblance to it. Picture an air handler that's just small and rectangular, and it sits in the attic, kind of like a giant or a tiny air handler, and then you just run small ducts to each bedroom. This provides a completely separate control system for the upstairs. And then you basically shut all the registers down and allow the normal system on your furnace and heat pump AC to cool or condition the downstairs. So you basically have now achieved a two-zone system with separate control. These work really well. They're very quiet. You've got to have good access in the attic. So a lot of the craftsman style houses have nice tall attics. Those work great for these. If you've got a low angle roof up there, or it's got vaulted ceilings in areas, it's not going to work. It takes a fair bit of space to get these installed. But if you've got a tall attic, they work really well. Of course, you can do a traditional mini split like that bottom right photo. I find a lot of people are not terribly excited about wall mount mini splits anymore. Obviously, aesthetically, they're not the best. You've got a big, 30, 35-inch wide hunk of plastic on your wall. So I'm getting a lot more requests for ducted mini splits, which just leave a grill, or these four-way cassettes. You probably started to see these more often. It's hard to tell from the photo how big they are. They're not small. They're good 24 inches across. The great thing is they sit perfectly flush. So you get all the benefits of an individual room mini split, but they're not protruding out from a wall, and they sit flush. Now, of course, you need access to install this, so they typically only work in the upper floor of a house with a decent size attic. They require 24-inch framing. Not all houses have this. I'd say a fair bit don't. So these one-way cassettes are great for a more restricted ceiling. This is just a stock photo, but we've done a fair bit of these lately. As the photo implies, they've got a pretty long, skinny profile. So you've got to make sure the rafters are pointed in the right direction, right? It can't be flipped 90 degrees. It has to sit in line with those rafters. But in most rooms, you would just put it all the way toward one wall, and it'll blow across. These work really well. They're very quiet. They're quieter even than a normal mini split because the mechanics of it are up in the wall. So you've just got the fan blades opening, or up in the ceiling rather, pushing the air out. So this can be combined with a regular air handler. Typical setup for a two-story home. Again, you just put a regular air handler that replaces your furnace, and then on the upstairs, maybe you pick one or two rooms, maybe the master bedroom or the office. If you're just going to do one or two rooms, I do this. If you want that whole upstairs nicely conditioned, then the ducted mini split's probably less expensive because you could just run small ducts to each room, and the extra cost of adding those ducts is fairly minor in comparison. Okay, we're finished with a few random thoughts and questions I get. This one I get a lot. Can I close my registers? A lot of people have been told, like, don't close any of your registers. It will ruin your system. But they want to because maybe one room is too hot, one room is too cold. They want to try to even out those temperatures. Most systems can handle closing, say, 20% of the registers. If you really want to test it out, we've got equipment that can measure it, and we could go around your house and you could shut as many registers as you'd like, and we can test to see if your system will handle it. But rule of thumb, I would say 15 to 20% of the registers in the house can be closed without hurting the system. If you have a room that's not getting warm enough in the winter or cold enough in the summer, and you've got these, this is probably why. They look nice, these registers, but they're very restrictive. You can see the wood dividers in the grill are very thick compared to like a metal unit, and that is heavily restricting the airflow. So if you've got a room that is not as conditioned as the other ones, this is a really cheap fix. You can get a nice kind of black wrought iron or modern steel look. It's not going to match the wood, but you could still get a nice aesthetically pleasing register that'll pass a lot more airflow. Feel free to reach out to me. I could point you in the right direction. If you look up the ratings before you buy this, it'll list the air resistance. So you just want to make sure you get one that's better than the wood, but pretty much any metal unit is going to be much better than those wood ones, and it's a really cheap way to add. This can add 25-30% more heat or cooling to a room just by flipping out that register. Okay. If your furnace is dead in the winter and you're calling a bunch of companies and nobody can get out there, maybe not 90%. I'd say 75% of the time, this is the culprit, and it's something you can fix yourself. If your furnace is dead, it's likely because you've got your condensate pump is malfunctioning. Modern high-efficiency furnaces have these little pumps that are wired to the furnace, and if they fail, they send a signal to the furnace saying, turn it off, shut it down. Unfortunately, there's no beeping, there's no screen telling you what's happened. Your furnace just won't turn on. If that happens, well, give me a call and I'll tell you how to fix it in the short term. But you can disable that wire and get your furnace up and running until somebody can get out there. You just connect the two wires, away you go, or pull that condensate pump out and put a drain pan underneath there. It doesn't fill up that much water. You could easily just drain it once a day for a few days until somebody gets out there. This has saved a lot of people during cold weather when nobody can get out there and their furnace is dead. 9 times out of 10, this is what's happening. Okay. Well, I could keep going on forever, but we'd probably lose a lot of interest. So I will hit pause there.